The old pickup truck rumbled down Maple Street, its engine making that familiar sound that reminded Staff Sergeant David Thompson of home. After 18 long months overseas, everything looked different yet exactly the same. The tree-lined street where his grandmother once lived still had those perfect lawns and pristine driveways. Nothing seemed out of place in Willowbrook Gardens. David pulled into the driveway of 412 Maple Street and turned off the engine. The silence hit him immediately. No distant sounds of helicopters, no radio chatter, no boots hitting concrete. Just the gentle rustle of leaves and a neighbor's lawnmower somewhere down the block. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to adjust to this new, quiet world. The house looked smaller than he remembered. Grandma Rose had left it to him in her will, along with a handwritten note saying she hoped it would give him a peaceful place to call home. The front porch still had her old rocking chair, and the garden still bloomed with those yellow roses she loved so much. David grabbed his duffel bag from the truck bed and walked toward the front door. As he fumbled with the keys, he noticed how clean everything was in this neighborhood. Every mailbox stood perfectly straight. Every lawn was cut to the same height. Even the trash cans were lined up like soldiers. David chuckled to himself. After spending months in dusty compounds overseas, this level of organization felt almost military. The 75th Ranger Regiment had been his life for the past 6 years. David had joined right after high school, looking for purpose and adventure. He found both, along with brotherhood and skills he never knew he possessed. But overseas deployments took their toll. He'd seen things and done things that most people would never understand. The uniform he wore carried the weight of every mission, every fallen friend, every moment when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Now, standing in his grandmother's living room, David felt caught between two worlds. The civilian world seemed so quiet, so safe, so normal. Everything here moved at a different pace. People worried about different things. Their biggest concerns were traffic jams and grocery store lines, not improvised explosive devices and enemy fire. David had always been proud of his uniform. The tan and green Army combat uniform represented something bigger than himself. It meant he was part of an elite fighting force that most people only saw in movies. The Ranger tab on his left shoulder wasn't just a piece of fabric. It represented months of the hardest training imaginable. The airborne wings above his name tape showed he was willing to jump out of perfectly good airplanes. The combat patches told stories of places most Americans couldn't pronounce. But wearing the uniform back home felt different somehow. Overseas, everyone around him wore the same thing. They understood the weight of it, the responsibility it carried. Here in suburbia, he stood out like a beacon. When he'd stopped at the grocery store on his way from the airport, people had stared. Some smiled and nodded respectfully. Others looked uncomfortable as if they didn't know what to say or how to act. The next few days fell into a routine. David would wake up early. Old habits from the military died hard. He'd go for his morning run around the neighborhood, usually in his physical training uniform, or sometimes his regular ACUs if he had appointments at the Veterans Affairs office later. The VA required a lot of paperwork for returning soldiers, and David found it easier to just wear his uniform rather than constantly changing clothes. During his morning runs, he began to notice the rhythm of Willowbrook Gardens. By 6 a.m., automatic sprinkler systems would kick on, sending perfect arcs of water across already green lawns. Dog walkers emerged around 6:30, following the same routes every day. By 7 a.m., garage doors would open and luxury cars would back out of driveways as residents headed to their office jobs. David also noticed he was being noticed. Curtains would move slightly as he jogged past houses. Conversations would pause as he walked by. It wasn't necessarily hostile, but it was obvious that his presence was being registered and discussed. In a neighborhood where everyone seemed to drive similar cars and wear similar clothes, his military uniform made him stand out. The house itself needed work. Grandma Rose had been in her 80s when she passed, and some repairs had been put off. David threw himself into fixing things, replacing loose floorboards, painting walls, cleaning gutters. The physical work felt good after months of structured military routine. It gave his hands something to do while his mind adjusted to civilian life. Working on the house also meant regular trips to the hardware store, the home improvement center, and various shops around town. David usually wore his uniform for these errands. It was practical. The pockets held his tools, his phone, his wallet, and his keys. More importantly, it felt right. After 6 years of wearing it almost every day, civilian clothes felt strange and unfamiliar. On his third day home, David was replacing the mailbox post when he first saw her. A woman in her 50s with perfectly styled gray hair was walking a small white dog. She wore a blue blazer despite the warm weather and carried herself with the kind of authority that suggested she was used to being in charge. As she approached, David could see her eyes taking in every detail. His uniform, his military vehicle in the driveway, the tools scattered on the lawn. The woman slowed her pace as she got closer, clearly wanting to get a better look. Her dog, a small fluffy breed that David couldn't identify, seemed more interested in sniffing the base of a nearby tree than in making human contact. But the woman was definitely studying him. David had learned to read people during his time in the service. You had to. Knowing who was friendly, who was neutral, and who might be trouble could mean the difference between a successful mission and a disaster. This woman definitely fell into the evaluating category. She wasn't openly hostile, but she wasn't friendly either. She was making mental notes, filing away information for future use. "Good morning," David called out, straightening up from his work. He'd been raised to be polite, especially to his elders. The woman nodded stiffly but didn't return the greeting. Instead, she continued walking, though David noticed she kept glancing back over her shoulder. After she'd gone about half a block, he saw her pull out her phone and make a call, speaking in low tones while occasionally gesturing back in his direction. David shrugged and returned to his work. He'd dealt with all kinds of people in the military, some friendly, some suspicious, some downright hostile. One thing he'd learned was not to take things personally. Everyone had their own story, their own reasons for acting the way they did. But as the days went on, he began to notice patterns. The same woman walked by every morning at the same time, always slowing down near his house. Other neighbors would pause their conversations when he appeared, then resume talking in hushed tones after he'd passed. Cars would slow down as they drove past his driveway, occupants craning their necks to see what he was doing. David tried not to let it bother him. He'd expected some adjustment period. Moving into any new neighborhood took time, and being a young single guy in a family-oriented community probably raised questions. Add in the fact that he was one of the few black residents on a street full of white families, and some curiosity was probably natural. The military had taught him patience. Good intelligence took time to develop, and understanding a new situation required careful observation. David decided to give his neighbors the same courtesy. Time to get used to him, just as he was taking time to get used to them. Little did he know that someone in Willowbrook Gardens was already planning to make that adjustment period much more difficult than it needed to be. 2 weeks into his new life in Willowbrook Gardens, David had settled into a comfortable routine. Morning runs, house repairs, and trips to the Veterans Affairs office filled his days. The neighborhood still felt foreign compared to the military bases he'd called home for 6 years. But he was starting to appreciate the quiet streets and well-maintained houses. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. David had just returned from a doctor's appointment at the VA hospital, a routine checkup that all returning soldiers had to complete. He wore his Army combat uniform because he'd learned that VA appointments went smoother when staff could immediately see his rank and unit patches. The uniform answered questions before they were asked and helped speed up the bureaucratic process. Walking to his mailbox to collect a few days' worth of letters and packages, David noticed the same gray-haired woman from before approaching with her small white dog. This time, however, she wasn't just walking past. She was heading directly toward him with purposeful strides, her face set in a stern expression that reminded him of his old drill sergeants. "Excuse me?" the woman called out when she was still 20 feet away. Her voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate attention. "I need to speak with you." David straightened up, automatically falling into the respectful posture the military had drilled into him. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman stopped about 6 feet away, her dog sitting obediently at her heels. She wore another blazer, this one navy blue, and carried a leather folder that looked official. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who took rules and regulations very seriously. "I'm Patricia Henderson," she announced, as if her name should mean something important. "I'm the president of the Willowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association. I've been observing some concerning behavior in our community, and I need to address it immediately." David felt his stomach tighten slightly. He'd heard about homeowners associations during his military briefings about civilian life, but he'd never dealt with one personally. "I'm not sure I understand, ma'am. What kind of concerning behavior?" Patricia opened her leather folder and pulled out a sheet of paper covered in neat handwriting. "According to our community guidelines, Section 12, Subsection 4, residents are prohibited from wearing costumes, uniforms, or theatrical attire in common areas or while visible from public streets." "Costumes?" David repeated, genuinely confused. He looked down at his uniform, then back at Patricia. "Ma'am, this isn't a costume. This is my military uniform." Patricia's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked more annoyed by his response. "Young man, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but dressing up like a soldier is inappropriate in a family neighborhood like ours. Children live here. We can't have people running around in military costumes pretending to be something they're not." The words hit David like a physical blow. In 6 years of military service, through multiple deployments and countless dangerous missions, no one had ever questioned the legitimacy of his uniform. The idea that someone would think he was playing dress-up felt insulting on a level he hadn't expected. "Ma'am," he said carefully, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "I'm not pretending to be anything. I'm Staff Sergeant David Thompson with the 75th Ranger Regiment. I just returned from an 18-month deployment overseas." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please. Do you really expect me to believe that someone like you is in some elite military unit? I've seen plenty of young men who think wearing military uniforms makes them look tough or important. It's called stolen valor, and it's illegal." The phrase "someone like you" hung in the air between them like a challenge. David had heard those words before, usually from people who made assumptions based on the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. He'd thought that wearing the uniform might shield him from such prejudices. But apparently, some people's biases ran deeper than respect for military service. "Ma'am, if you'd like to verify my service record, I can provide you with my military identification card and contact information for my commanding officer," David offered, trying to keep the conversation professional. "I don't need to see any fake identification cards," Patricia snapped. "What I need is for you to stop this ridiculous charade immediately. Take off that costume and dispose of it properly. If I see you wearing it again in our community, I'll be forced to take more serious action." David felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, then consciously relaxed them. Years of military discipline had taught him how to control his emotions even when provoked. Losing his temper with a civilian, especially an older woman, would only make the situation worse. "Mrs. Henderson," he said slowly, "I understand you have concerns about your community, but I assure you that I'm a legitimate member of the United States Army. I live at 412 Maple Street, which was left to me by my grandmother. I have every right to wear my military uniform, and I'm not violating any reasonable community guidelines." "Your grandmother?" Patricia's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You mean Rose Thompson? That sweet old lady who lived there for 30 years? "Yes, ma'am. Rose Thompson was my grandmother." For a moment, Patricia seemed taken aback by this information. David could see her mental gears turning, trying to reconcile the grandmother she'd known with the young black soldier standing in front of her. But rather than softening her position, she seemed to grow more defensive. "Well, regardless of who your grandmother was, the rules are the rules. This is a respectable neighborhood with standards to maintain. We can't have people walking around in military gear, whether it's real or fake. It makes other residents uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" David repeated. "How does seeing a soldier in uniform make people uncomfortable?" "Look," Patricia said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. "I'm sure you think you're honoring the military or something, but this isn't appropriate. Real soldiers don't just walk around in uniform all the time. They have jobs and wear regular clothes like everyone else." David almost laughed at the absurdity of the statement. Ma'am, real soldiers wear uniforms to work every day. We wear them to medical appointments, official meetings, and any time we're conducting military business. That's exactly what real soldiers do. Don't get smart with me, young man, Patricia warned, her voice rising slightly. I've been dealing with problem residents for 15 years as HOA president. I know trouble when I see it, and I'm telling you right now that this behavior stops today. What behavior exactly? Living in my own house? Checking my mail? Following all applicable laws and regulations? Patricia's face was beginning to flush with anger. The behavior is this constant display of fake military credentials, disrupting our peaceful community with your early morning activities. And now this argumentative attitude when a concerned neighbor tries to help you understand our community standards. Help me understand? David's voice remained calm, but Patricia could probably hear the steel underneath it. Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't need help understanding anything. I understand that I'm a United States soldier who served his country honorably. I understand that I own property in this neighborhood legally, and I understand that I have the same rights as any other resident here. Patricia snapped her folder shut with a sharp sound. We'll see about that. The HOA board meets next Tuesday evening, and this issue will definitely be on our agenda. I suggest you use the time between now and then to reconsider your attitude and your wardrobe choices. She turned to walk away, but paused after a few steps. And another thing, that military vehicle in your driveway is also a violation of our guidelines. Personal vehicles should look residential, not like something from an army base. David glanced at his pickup truck, a standard civilian vehicle he'd bought used from another soldier. The only thing that made it look military was its green paint job and the small army decal in the back window. Mrs. Henderson, he called after her. That's just a regular pickup truck. But Patricia was already walking away, her small dog trotting obediently beside her. David watched her go, noting how she pulled out her phone almost immediately and began what appeared to be an animated conversation. Standing alone by his mailbox, David felt the weight of the encounter settling on his shoulders. He'd expected some adjustment challenges when moving to civilian life, but he hadn't anticipated having his military service questioned or his right to wear his uniform challenged. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent the last 18 months in a war zone, risking his life to protect the freedoms that people like Patricia took for granted. Now he was home, and apparently the biggest threat he faced wasn't enemy combatants or improvised explosive devices. It was a homeowners association president with a rule book and an attitude problem. David looked down at his uniform, at the patches and ribbons that told the story of his service. Each piece of fabric represented something he'd earned through sweat, sacrifice, and dedication. The Ranger tab alone had cost him months of the most grueling training imaginable. His combat patch showed he'd served in harm's way, far from the safety and comfort of suburban neighborhoods like this one. As he walked back toward his house, David made a decision. The next morning, David woke up to find an official-looking envelope stuck under his front door. The Willowbrook Gardens HOA letterhead was embossed at the top, and the document inside was typed in formal legal language. It was his first official violation notice. Violation Code 12.4, Inappropriate Attire in Common Areas. David read aloud in his kitchen while drinking his morning coffee. The letter went on to describe his repeated wearing of military costume or theatrical uniform as a disruption to community standards. It demanded that he cease this behavior immediately or face escalating fines starting at $50 per occurrence. David set the letter on his kitchen table and shook his head. In all his years of military service, he'd never imagined that wearing his uniform would become a legal issue. The letter was signed by Patricia Henderson and 2 other HOA board members he'd never met. Over the following weeks, the harassment intensified in ways David hadn't expected. Every morning when he went for his run, he noticed certain neighbors watching him from their windows. Some would step outside to water their plants or check their mailboxes, timing their activities to coincide with his exercise routine. It felt like being under surveillance in his own neighborhood. The complaints started coming regularly. One week, it was about his morning runs being too early and disturbing the peace. Another week, someone reported that his pickup truck was parked at an improper angle in his driveway. Then came complaints about the small American flag he'd hung from his front porch. which supposedly violated guidelines about decorative displays. David tried to ignore the petty harassment, but it was wearing on him. Every day brought new scrutiny, new complaints, new reasons why his normal activities were somehow problematic. He'd fought in combat zones that felt less hostile than his own neighborhood. The situation reached a new level on a busy Saturday afternoon at Miller's Grocery, the main supermarket that served Willowbrook Gardens and the surrounding area. David had stopped by to pick up supplies for a barbecue grill he was planning to buy. He wore his Army combat uniform because he had a meeting with a VA counselor scheduled later that day. As he walked down the cereal aisle, pushing his cart and checking items off his list, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Excuse me, everyone. I need your attention for a moment." David turned around to see Patricia Henderson standing in the middle of the aisle, her voice loud enough to carry throughout the store. Other shoppers stopped what they were doing and turned to look. A few store employees also moved closer, probably wondering if there was some kind of emergency. "This man," Patricia announced, pointing directly at David, "is impersonating a United States soldier. He's been walking around our neighborhood for weeks wearing a fake military uniform, pretending to be something he's not." The entire store seemed to freeze. David felt every eye in the place focusing on him, and he could see the confusion on people's faces. Some looked concerned, others appeared curious, and a few seemed ready to intervene if necessary. "Ma'am," David said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation, "this really isn't the place for this conversation." "Oh, but it absolutely is the place," Patricia continued, her voice getting louder and more dramatic. "Stolen valor is a federal crime. This young man is dishonoring every real soldier who ever served our country by wearing that costume." A middle-aged man in a baseball cap stepped forward. "Is that true, son? Are you really in the military?" David felt his face getting warm, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, sir. I'm Staff Sergeant David Thompson with the 75th Ranger Regiment. I just returned from deployment overseas." "Don't listen to him," Patricia interrupted. "Real soldiers don't just walk around in uniform going grocery shopping. This is all fake. The uniform, the story, everything." An older woman near the pasta section spoke up. "How do you know it's fake?" "It looks real to me." Patricia turned toward the woman with the confidence of someone who was used to being believed without question. "Because I've been dealing with this situation for weeks. This person moved into our neighborhood claiming to be some kind of elite soldier, but his story doesn't add up. Real military people don't act like this." "Act like what?" asked a young father holding his toddler daughter. "Like attention seekers," Patricia replied. "Real soldiers are humble and quiet. They don't parade around in uniform trying to get special treatment and sympathy." David felt something snap inside him. Weeks of harassment, complaints, and now this public humiliation in front of dozens of strangers. But instead of losing his temper, his military training kicked in. He reached into his wallet and pulled out his military identification card. "Sir," he said to the man in the baseball cap, "would you mind taking a look at this?" The man examined the ID card carefully, then looked up at David's uniform, checking the name tape against the card. "This looks legitimate to me. Same name, same face, issued by the Department of Defense?" "ID cards can be faked," Patricia insisted, though she hadn't actually looked at the card herself. "You can buy anything online these days." A teenage store employee had started recording the confrontation with his phone, and David noticed several other people doing the same thing. The situation was escalating beyond anything he'd experienced in civilian life. "Ma'am," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "you're making accusations about federal crimes based on absolutely no evidence. You're disrupting this business and bothering these people with your personal vendetta against me." "Personal vendetta?" Patricia's voice rose to near shouting level. "I'm protecting my community from fraud and deception. Someone needs to call the police and have this imposter arrested." That's when an unexpected voice joined the conversation. "Actually, ma'am, I think you're the one who needs to stop." Everyone turned to see a man in his 60s approaching from the produce section. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap and walked with the straight posture of someone who'd served in the military. His cart was full of groceries, suggesting he'd been shopping normally before being drawn into the commotion. "I'm Robert Chen," the man announced. "Vietnam veteran, 101st Airborne. I've been listening to this whole thing, and I can tell you that young man's uniform is absolutely legitimate." Patricia looked flustered by this development. "How could you possibly know that?" Robert smiled grimly. "Because I spent 2 tours in Vietnam and 30 years working with veterans after I came home. I know what real military bearing looks like, and I know what real uniforms look like. This soldier is the genuine article." He turned to address David directly. "What unit did you say you were with, son?" 75th Ranger Regiment, sir." "Just finished an 18-month rotation?" Robert nodded approvingly. "Rangers. That explains the bearing and the fitness level. Those boys don't mess around." He looked back at Patricia with obvious disapproval. "Lady, you're way out of line here. This man earned the right to wear that uniform, and you're making a fool of yourself." Patricia's face was now bright red. Whether from anger or embarrassment wasn't clear. "I don't care what you think you know. The HOA has rules, and this person is violating them." "The HOA?" Robert laughed. "Ma'am, no homeowners association has the authority to tell a service member when and where he can wear his uniform. That's federal jurisdiction, and it's none of your business." By now, a small crowd had gathered in the cereal aisle. The store manager had appeared and was trying to calm the situation, asking everyone to lower their voices and move their conversation outside if necessary. David looked around at all the faces staring at him, some supportive, some curious, some still unsure what to believe. This wasn't how he'd imagined his transition to civilian life would go. He'd expected challenges, but not this kind of public spectacle. "Mrs. Henderson," David said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm going to finish my shopping and go home. I suggest you do the same. If you have legitimate concerns about anything I'm doing, you can address them through proper channels. But I won't tolerate any more public harassment." Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but Robert Chen stepped forward again. "Ma'am, I think you've said enough. This young man has been more patient with you than you deserve. If I were him, I'd be talking to a lawyer about harassment charges." The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama seemed to wind down. David finished his shopping quickly, paid for his groceries, and headed for the parking lot. But he could hear Patricia still talking to anyone who would listen, insisting that she was right and that everyone else was being fooled. As David loaded his groceries into his truck, Robert Chen approached him in the parking lot. "Son," the older veteran said, "don't let that woman get to you. Some people just can't stand to see others succeed, especially when those others don't look like what they expect." David nodded gratefully. "Thank you for speaking up, sir." That meant a lot. "Rangers lead the way," Robert said with a grin, "and sometimes old paratroopers need to back them up." Driving home, David realized that the confrontation had probably been recorded by multiple people and would likely end up on social media. What had started as a simple neighborhood dispute was turning into something much bigger and more public than he'd ever wanted. The video from the grocery store confrontation spread faster than David had expected. By Monday morning, it had been shared hundreds of times on various social media platforms. The teenager who recorded it had posted it with the caption, "HOA Karen attacks Army Ranger at grocery store." And the internet had done what the internet does best. It had chosen sides. David's phone buzzed, constantly with friend requests, messages of support, and interview requests from local news stations. He ignored most of them, but the attention made him uncomfortable. He'd never wanted to become a viral sensation, especially not over something like this. What worried him more was how Patricia Henderson was responding to the negative attention. Instead of backing down, she seemed to be doubling down on her accusations. At Tuesday's HOA board meeting, which David chose not to attend, Patricia had apparently presented what she called evidence of David's suspicious behavior to the other board members. The meeting minutes, which were posted on the community website, made for disturbing reading. Patricia had compiled a detailed log of David's daily activities over the past 3 weeks. She knew what time he left his house each morning, how long his runs lasted, when he came and went in his truck, and even what he wore on different days. The level of surveillance was shocking. Patricia had somehow convinced herself and at least 2 other board members that David's normal daily routine was evidence of something sinister. His early morning runs were described as disruptive, military-style exercises. His trips to the VA hospital were labeled as suspicious frequent absences from the neighborhood. even his home improvement. Work was characterized as modifications consistent with preparing a residence for illegal activities, reading. The meeting minutes felt like looking at intelligence, reports from a hostile foreign government rather than notes from a neighborhood association meeting. The paranoia and twisted logic reminded David of conspiracy theories he'd encountered overseas, where frightened people saw threats in every shadow. But Patricia wasn't finished. On Wednesday evening, David returned home from a weekend training exercise with his reserve unit to find his mailbox completely destroyed. Someone had taken a baseball bat or similar weapon to the metal post and the box itself. His mail was scattered across his front lawn, some of it torn and muddy from the sprinkler system. Spray painted across his driveway in bright red letters were the words "Fake Soldier" and "Stolen Valor." The paint was still slightly wet, suggesting the vandalism had happened recently. David stood in his driveway, looking at the destruction, and felt something he hadn't experienced since his darkest days in combat. A sense of being truly alone and under siege. At least overseas, he'd known who the enemy was and why they were fighting. Here in suburban America, he was being attacked by people who were supposed to be his neighbors, his fellow citizens. He called the police to report the vandalism, and Officer Martinez arrived within 30 minutes. The young policeman was professional and thorough, taking photos of the damage and collecting paint samples. But when David explained the background of his conflict with the HOA, Officer Martinez's expression grew concerned. "Mr. Thompson," the officer said, "I have to tell you that we received another call about you earlier this week. Someone reported that you might be illegally wearing military insignia." David felt his heart sink. "Who made that report?" "I can't give you specific names, but it came from someone in your neighborhood association. We looked into it and determined that you're legitimate military, so no action was taken. But I wanted you to know that these complaints are happening." "What kind of complaints?" Officer Martinez consulted his notes. "The caller claimed you were potentially dangerous, possibly suffering from PTSD or other mental health issues that made you a threat to the community. They also suggested you might be involved in illegal weapons trafficking because of your frequent trips in and out of the neighborhood." The accusations were so outrageous that David almost laughed. But the serious expression on the officer's face stopped him. Someone was systematically trying to destroy his reputation and possibly get him arrested on false charges. "Officer Martinez," David said carefully, "I'm a staff sergeant in the Army Reserve. My trips in and out of the neighborhood are for work, VA appointments, and normal errands. I don't have any illegal weapons, I'm not trafficking anything, and while I do receive treatment for some service-related issues, I'm not a danger to anyone." "I believe you," the officer replied. "But I want you to understand that someone is working very hard to paint you as a problem. False reports to police can be considered harassment, but proving intent can be difficult." After Officer Martinez left, David sat on his front steps and tried to process what was happening to him. In the space of a month, he'd gone from being a decorated combat veteran, looking forward to a peaceful transition to civilian life, to being the target of a harassment campaign that was escalating beyond anything he could have imagined. His phone rang, and he saw it was his unit commander. "Lieutenant Colonel Williams, Thompson." The colonel's voice was stern. "I just saw a video online of you in some kind of confrontation at a grocery store. Want to tell me what's going on?" David spent 20 minutes explaining the situation to his commanding officer, from Patricia Henderson's initial accusations to the destroyed mailbox in his driveway. Colonel Williams listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is serious, Thompson," the colonel said when David finished. "False accusations of stolen valor can damage not just your reputation, but the reputation of the entire unit. I need you to document everything. Every interaction, every complaint, every incident of harassment. If this escalates any further, we may need to involve military legal counsel." "Yes, sir." "I've been keeping records, but I'll make them more detailed." "Good. And Thompson, don't engage with these people anymore. No more conversations, no more explanations, no more trying to be reasonable. Document everything, but don't give them any ammunition to use against you." After the call ended, David realized that his personal problem had become a potential issue for his entire unit. The thought of his fellow Rangers being affected by Patricia Henderson's vendetta made him angrier than any of. The personal attacks had Thursday morning brought another, official-looking envelope under his door. This one was different. Heavier paper, more formal language, and a law firm's letterhead at the top. The Willowbrook Gardens HOA had hired attorneys. The letter informed David that he was in violation of multiple community covenants and was being assessed fines totaling $200. The violations included repeated inappropriate attire, modification of property without HOA approval, disturbing the peace with early morning activities, and creating a hostile environment for other residents. The letter also informed him that if the violations were not corrected within 10 days, the HOA would begin legal proceedings to force compliance, potentially including liens against his property. David had seen enough legal documents during his military career to recognize that this was serious. The HOA wasn't just harassing him anymore. They were trying to take legal action that could affect his ownership of his grandmother's house. That afternoon, he drove to the office of James Wright, the attorney who had handled his grandmother's estate. Mr. Wright was a man in his 70s who had practiced law in the area for over 40 years. He listened to David's story with growing amazement and increasing anger. "Son," Mr. Wright said when David finished explaining the situation, "in all my years practicing law, I've never seen an HOA case quite like this. What you're describing sounds less like a neighborhood dispute and more like systematic harassment based on racial bias. What can we do about it?" "Several things. First, we're going to respond to their legal threats with some legal reality. HOAs have authority over certain things, but they can't override federal law regarding military uniforms or discriminate against protected classes. Second, we're going to file counter-complaints for harassment and possible civil rights violations." Mr. Wright leaned forward across his desk. "David, I want you to understand something. This isn't really about uniforms or HOA rules. This is about certain people who can't accept change in their neighborhood and are using whatever weapons they can find to fight it. But they picked the wrong target and they're using the wrong tactics." As David left the attorney's office, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was no longer facing this battle alone, but he also realized that the conflict was about to escalate to a level that would affect everyone involved. That evening, he sat in his grandmother's rocking chair on the front porch, looking out at the quiet street where he'd hoped to build a peaceful life. The damaged mailbox had been temporarily repaired with duct tape, and he'd scrubbed most of the paint off his driveway, but the scars of the harassment campaign were still visible. David thought about his grandmother Rose, who had lived peacefully in this neighborhood for 30 years. He wondered what she would think about the way her neighbors were treating her grandson, and whether she had ever experienced the kind of prejudice that now seemed so obvious. As darkness fell and the streetlights came on, David made a decision. He wasn't going to be driven out of his own home by fear and harassment. If Patricia Henderson and her supporters wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But it would be fought in courtrooms and through proper legal channels, not through vandalism and false accusations. What none of them realized was that David's military training had taught him something that would soon become very relevant. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and backup was already on the way. David had no idea that his story had reached far beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook Gardens. What he didn't know was that several of his fellow Rangers had been following the viral videos and social media posts about their teammates' situation. Military units are like families, and when one member is under attack, the others take notice. Sergeant First Class Kevin Brooks had been David's squad leader during their last deployment. When he saw the grocery store video, he immediately shared it in their unit's private group chat with a message that got everyone's attention. "Our boy Thompson is getting harassed by some HOA witch. This is not okay." The response was immediate and unanimous. Rangers don't abandon each other, whether on the battlefield or in suburban neighborhoods. Within hours, a plan was forming that would give Patricia Henderson and the Willowbrook Gardens HOA an education they would never forget. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, David's commanding officer, had been watching the situation closely since their phone conversation. When he learned that his soldiers were planning an unofficial response, he made a command decision that would change everything. "Gentlemen," he told his senior staff during their morning briefing, "one of our rangers is being systematically harassed and falsely accused of stolen valor by a civilian HOA. This is not just a personal attack on Sergeant Thompson. It's an attack on the integrity of our unit and our service." The colonel's aide, Captain Mitchell, looked up from her notes. "What kind of response are you considering, sir?" "The kind that makes it very clear who David Thompson really is and what he's earned the right to wear," Colonel Williams replied with a slight smile. "I think it's time for a community outreach visit." On Friday afternoon, Patricia Henderson called an emergency HOA board meeting. She'd been receiving angry messages and phone calls all week from people who'd seen the viral videos, and she wanted to discuss security measures for the upcoming regular board meeting on Tuesday evening. "We need to be prepared for possible disruptions," Patricia told the 4 other board members who showed up for the emergency session. "This whole situation has attracted unwanted attention from outside agitators who don't understand the facts." Board member Ronald Peterson, a retired accountant, looked uncomfortable. "Patricia, maybe we should reconsider our approach here. The legal costs are mounting, and frankly, some of the evidence you've presented seems pretty thin." "Thin?" Patricia's voice rose indignantly. "I've documented everything. The pattern of behavior is clear to anyone willing to see it." "But what if we're wrong?" asked Janet Morrison, the board secretary. "What if he really is military?" "The backlash has been pretty intense." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "People on the internet will believe anything. We can't let mob mentality override our responsibility to protect this community." What Patricia didn't know was that her Tuesday evening meeting was about to have some very special attendees. Tuesday evening arrived with perfect weather, clear skies and comfortable temperatures that would make outdoor activities pleasant. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood's main entrance. Patricia arrived early to set up, bringing her usual folder of documentation and a portable microphone system she'd rented to ensure her voice would carry throughout the room. She expected a larger turnout than usual, given all the recent attention their neighborhood dispute had generated. At exactly 6:45 p.m., residents began arriving for the meeting. The usual attendees filed in, the same 15 or 20 people who came to every meeting, mostly retirees and long-term residents who took community governance seriously. But at 6:55 p.m., something unprecedented happened in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook Gardens. A convoy of military vehicles turned onto Maple Street. The first vehicle was a black SUV with government plates. Behind it came a military Humvee, followed by 2 more official-looking vehicles. The convoy moved slowly and deliberately down the street, drawing attention from every house they passed. Residents came out onto their porches and driveways, pointing and whispering to each other. Children pressed their faces against windows, and several people started recording with their phones. The vehicles pulled into the community center parking lot with military precision. Car doors opened simultaneously, and out stepped 8 soldiers in full-dress uniforms. Leading the group was Lieutenant Colonel Williams, his uniform displaying ribbons and decorations that spoke of years of distinguished service. Behind him came Captain Mitchell, Sergeant First Class Brooks, and 5 other Rangers, all wearing their dress blue uniforms with spit-shined boots and perfect military bearing. The sight was impressive and unmistakably official. These were not pretend soldiers or weekend warriors. These were career military personnel who carried themselves with the confidence and authority that comes from years of training and combat experience. Inside the community center, Patricia was calling the meeting to order when she heard a commotion outside. Through the windows, she could see people gathering in the parking lot and pointing toward the military vehicles. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, trying to regain control of the room, "if we could please focus on our agenda for this evening." The community center door opened, and Lieutenant Colonel Williams stepped inside, followed by his soldiers in formation. The room fell completely silent. Colonel Williams surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to command. His gaze settled on Patricia Henderson, who was standing at the front of the room with her mouth slightly open in surprise. "Good evening," the colonel said. his voice carrying easily throughout the room without need for the microphone. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Williams, commanding officer of the 75th Ranger Regiment. I believe you've been having some discussions about one of my soldiers." Patricia found her voice, though it came out higher-pitched than usual. We're conducting a private HOA meeting. This is for residents only." "Ma'am," Colonel Williams replied, politely but firmly, "my understanding is that you've been conducting a public campaign questioning the legitimacy of Staff Sergeant Thompson's military service. When civilian organizations make accusations of stolen valor against my soldiers, it becomes a matter of military concern." The colonel gestured to Captain Mitchell, who stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio. Captain Mitchell will be presenting Staff Sergeant Thompson's official service record, including his decorations and combat history. Captain Mitchell opened the portfolio and began reading in a clear, professional voice. "Staff Sergeant David Thompson enlisted in the United States Army 6 years ago. He completed basic training, advanced individual training, airborne school, and successfully graduated from the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program." She continued reading Thompson's achievements: multiple deployments, combat operations, specialized training courses, and decorations including a Bronze Star Medal, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Badge. "Staff Sergeant Thompson has served with distinction in some of the most challenging environments our military operates in," Captain Mitchell concluded. "His service record is exemplary, and any suggestion that he is not entitled to wear the uniform he has earned is both factually incorrect and personally insulting to every member of this unit." The room remained completely silent. Several HOA board members were staring at Patricia, who looked like she was trying to disappear into the floor. Colonel Williams stepped forward again. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Patricia directly, "I understand you are Mrs. Henderson, the president of this organization." "Yes," Patricia managed to whisper. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to understand something very important. The uniform that Staff Sergeant Thompson wears represents more than just clothing. It represents 6 years of dedicated service to his country, multiple combat deployments where he risked his life for the freedoms you enjoy, and a level of training and commitment that very few Americans will ever achieve." The colonel's voice remained calm and professional, but there was steel underneath it. "When you publicly accuse one of my soldiers of stolen valor, you're not just attacking him personally. You're attacking the integrity of every soldier who has ever worn this uniform, including the ones who didn't come home." Sergeant First Class Brooks stepped forward. "Sir, if I may," he said to the colonel, who nodded permission. Brooks turned to address the room. "I served alongside David Thompson in Afghanistan. I watched him pull 2 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. I watched him volunteer for the most dangerous missions because he knew his skills could keep other people alive. This man is not playing soldier. He is a soldier, and he's earned every piece of cloth on that uniform." Another ranger spoke up. "Staff Sergeant Thompson received his Purple Heart when an IED exploded near his convoy. He was injured but refused evacuation until he made sure his entire squad was accounted for. That's the kind of man you've been harassing for wearing a uniform." One by one, the Rangers shared stories of David's service, his character, and his dedication. With each story, Patricia Henderson seemed to shrink further into her chair. Several residents in the room were visibly moved, and a few were quietly wiping away tears. Colonel Williams concluded the presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this clears up any questions about Staff Sergeant Thompson's legitimacy as a soldier. He has not only earned the right to wear his uniform, he has earned our respect and gratitude." The colonel turned back to Patricia. "Mrs. Henderson, I trust that any further questions about Sergeant Thompson's military service can be directed to me personally. My contact information will be left with your board secretary." As the military delegation prepared to leave, Colonel Williams had one final message for the room. Staff Sergeant Thompson chose to make this community his home after serving his country overseas. He deserves to be welcomed as a neighbor and respected as a veteran. I hope that can happen going forward." The Rangers filed out of the community center with the same precision they had entered. Outside, curious neighbors had gathered to watch the departure of the military convoy. As the vehicles drove away, Patricia Henderson sat alone at the front of the room, her folder of accusations and complaints suddenly seeming very small and very foolish. The room was still silent, but the silence now felt heavy with judgment rather than surprise. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Patricia Henderson was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. The morning after the military visit, David woke up to something he hadn't experienced since moving to Willowbrook Gardens: complete silence. No angry phone calls, no violation notices under his door, no neighbors watching his every move from their windows. It felt almost strange. His phone had been buzzing since dawn, but these were different kinds of messages than he'd been receiving. Instead of threats and complaints, he was getting apologies. Text messages from neighbors he'd never even met. Emails from people who had seen the videos online, and voicemails from residents expressing their embarrassment about how he'd been treated. The first knock on his door came at 9 a.m. David opened it to find Janet Morrison, the HOA board secretary, standing on his porch with a manila envelope and a nervous expression. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "I wanted to personally deliver this to you and apologize for everything that's happened." Inside the envelope was an official letter from the Willowbrook Gardens HOA board. It was brief and to the point. All violations against David Thompson were hereby dismissed, all fines were canceled, and the board formally apologized for any inconvenience or distress caused by their actions. "Where's Mrs. Henderson?" David asked. Janet looked uncomfortable. "Patricia submitted her resignation this morning, effective immediately. She also asked me to give you this." She handed David a second envelope, this one with his name written in Patricia's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief handwritten note. "Mr. Thompson, I was wrong about everything. I let my fears and prejudices cloud my judgment, and I caused terrible harm to a man who deserved respect instead of suspicion. I cannot undo the damage I've done, but I can step aside so that healing can begin. I am deeply sorry. Patricia Henderson." David read the note twice, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. The apology was genuine, but it came after weeks of harassment that had changed his life in ways that couldn't be easily undone. Over the next few days, the transformation in his neighborhood was remarkable. People who had previously avoided him now went out of their way to speak to him. Elderly Mr. Patterson from across the street brought over a homemade apple pie and stayed for an hour sharing stories about his own military service in Korea. The Johnson family from 2 doors down invited him to their son's birthday barbecue. Mrs. Chen, Robert's wife, who had heard about her husband's defense of David at the grocery store, brought over Chinese dumplings and thanked him for his service. But perhaps the most meaningful visit came from an unexpected source. On Saturday morning, David was working in his front yard when a car pulled up and Patricia Henderson stepped out. She looked older somehow, as if the events of the past month had aged her beyond her years. "Mr. Thompson," she said, approaching slowly, "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I was hoping we could talk." David set down his gardening tools and studied her face. The arrogance and anger that had defined their previous encounters were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "What would you like to say, Mrs. Henderson?" Patricia took a deep breath. "I want to explain, not to excuse my behavior, but to help you understand how someone could be so completely wrong about something so important." She gestured toward his porch chairs. "May I sit down?" David nodded, and they both sat down. Their first civil conversation since this whole ordeal began. "When I moved to this neighborhood 20 years ago," Patricia began, "it was different. Quieter, more predictable. Everyone looked the same, acted the same, wanted the same things. I thought that was what made it special." She paused, looking out at the street. "When your grandmother lived here, she was part of that world I understood. She was quiet, she followed the rules, she didn't challenge anything. When you moved in, you represented change. And I realize now that change terrified me." David listened without interrupting, curious to understand how this had all started. "I saw a young black man in a military uniform, and instead of seeing a soldier, I saw everything I was afraid of. I saw someone different from me, someone I didn't understand. Someone who might change the neighborhood I'd worked so hard to control. Patricia's voice was getting quieter. I convinced myself that you couldn't possibly be legitimate because it was easier than admitting that my assumptions about people like you were wrong. Every time you proved me wrong, I just doubled down on my accusations, because admitting the truth would have meant facing some very uncomfortable facts about myself. She turned to look at David directly. I was raised in a different time, with different ideas about people and places and who belonged where. That's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. I let fear and prejudice turn me into someone I'm ashamed of. David considered her words carefully. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your honesty. But you have to understand that your fears and assumptions caused real damage. You tried to destroy my reputation. You filed false reports with the police. You encouraged vandalism of my property. Those actions had consequences beyond just hurting my feelings. I know, Patricia said, tears starting to form in her eyes. I know I can't undo any of that. But I want you to know that seeing those soldiers talk about who you really are, hearing about the things you've done for your country, it changed something fundamental in how I see the world. She reached into her purse and pulled out a check. This won't fix anything, but I want to pay for the damage to your mailbox and your driveway. It's the least I can do. David looked at the check, then back at Patricia. Mrs. Henderson, I don't want your money, but I do want something else from you. What's that? I want you to promise me that the next time you see someone who looks different or acts different from what you expect, you'll remember this conversation. I want you to remember that there's usually more to people's stories than what you see on the surface. Patricia nodded earnestly. I promise you that. And Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to be better than I was. After Patricia left, David sat on his porch, thinking about forgiveness and second chances. The military had taught him that sometimes former enemies could become allies, and that healing was often more valuable than punishment. The following week brought more positive changes. The new HOA president, Ronald Peterson, visited David to discuss updating the community guidelines to ensure that no resident would ever again face the kind of harassment David had endured. They also established a community diversity and inclusion committee to help bridge cultural gaps between neighbors. Local media outlets picked up the story, and David found himself reluctantly accepting a few interview requests. He used the attention to talk about the challenges veterans face when transitioning to civilian life and the importance of communities welcoming home their service members. The viral videos had also caught the attention of veteran advocacy groups. David was invited to speak at several events about discrimination against military personnel and the legal protections available to service members facing harassment. Robert Chen, the Vietnam veteran who had defended David at the grocery store, became a regular visitor and eventually a close friend. The two veterans found common ground in their shared experiences of military service and their commitment to helping other veterans navigate civilian life. 6 months later, David stood in his front yard looking at the small American flag flying from his porch, the same flag that had once been the subject of an HOA complaint. His mailbox had been replaced with a larger, sturdier model that several neighbors had insisted on paying for as a gesture of community support. The house that his grandmother had left him had become more than just a place to live. It had become the center of a community transformation that neither he nor Patricia Henderson could have imagined when their conflict began. David's morning runs were no longer solitary affairs. Other neighbors, including several fellow veterans, had started joining him. What had once been seen as disruptive military behavior was now viewed as a positive community activity that brought people together. The grocery store, where the infamous confrontation had taken place, now had a small memorial display honoring local veterans, with David's photo prominently featured alongside other service members from the area. Patricia Henderson had kept her word about becoming a better person. She volunteered at the local VA hospital and had become an advocate for veteran rights. She and David maintained a cordial relationship, built on mutual respect for each other's journey toward understanding and growth. The story of the HOA dispute had become something of a legend in their community, a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and assumptions, but also a hopeful story about the possibility of redemption and change. David often thought, about his grandmother Rose and what she would have thought about everything that had happened in her quiet little neighborhood. He imagined she would have been proud that her house had become a place where important conversations about respect, understanding, and community could take place. As he watched his neighbors coming and going, David realized that he had found something he hadn't expected when he moved to Willowbrook Gardens. He had found a home where he truly belonged, not because he fit in perfectly, but because the community had learned to embrace the differences that made it stronger.